Okay, Hardianas.
Welcome. First thing off the top before we get deep, a deep dive, a deep trip on Hard Yarns podcast. Big shout out to our Patreon, newest Patreon.
Ryan. He doesn't have a last name.
Yeah, we just got
Ryan.
the Patreon formerly known as Ryan.
Yes.
So
thank you for joining. Really appreciate that. And depending on the level, you're going to get a T-shirt. So how good.
Yep. Thanks to all the Patreons. Your continued support is awesome. If you want to donate or join the Patreon, it just helps the podcast get awesome guests like our one today.
Yeah.
And we can eventually get millions of Patreon and support their research.
Well, yeah. And I guess I think about 14 or 15 of the Patreons are getting their T-shirts today or tomorrow. Yeah. So.
And any other Patreons listening, check the Patreon app or your Patreon website because Who's Rhyme is this Sunday and we've got some deals for you. VIPs, you're coming for free.
Oh, yeah, perfect.
Everyone else gets cheaper tickets.
Also, before we introduce our guests, this little section of the podcast, if you're at all interested in advertising your business or your brand or product or whatever you want, like you would have noticed the last few weeks, we had Athletic Institute at the start. Hit us up and we can talk to you about how you can get a shout out for your business.
But we have got Dr. Stephen Bright here.
Is it our first doctor?
Yes.
Wow, that's a big one.
Yeah.
No more is it bro science, Delby. It's
right.
real science.
Real science. So what did we cover today, Dr. Stephen? We covered what? Maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, we chuck you in on the intro as well.
Yeah.
Do my introduction.
Yeah.
We talked about psychedelic science, stigma associated with substance use, the history of different, prohibition, the history of psychedelics, and a little bit around media and stigma and misinformation.
Yeah.
And capitalism. We talked a bit about capitalism.
So surprising that it got down to capitalism and prioritizing profit over the benefit of all, which was it was a really good episode.
It's a great episode, and there's going to be so many more questions from listeners.
Yes.
But we're hoping I can bribe the doctor to come back with a few free tickets to the teacher comedy night July 8th.
Awesome.
So enjoy. Let's get hard.
Welcome to Hard Yarns Podcast. I am fucking fat.
Anything Chris White says, please disregard it.
5D is actually a state of being. It's a unity consciousness.
That was Hard Yarns with me, Frankie Rose. So I'm going to throw it over to your co-host,
Daniel Delby.
And Cameron Brand.
I would do this and then I'd gong.
Free in attendance for the millions listening at home. Let's get hard.
Say it again, but then pause for 2 seconds, then do that. Then
Use your hands, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, it was just so rehearsed.
I don't really like that. I like to be able to just have my points come out and just talk naturally.
Well,
Is it because it's their product?
yeah, it is, and they want it to look good.
Yeah.
But it now means that when I watch a TED talk, I can't help but think that, this is so rehearsed. It's not just the person being natural. They've been told every bit of their body language, their voice, their intonation. It's crazy.
Yeah, you can. I fully pick that up when I'm watching like the kids, especially do their talk about like learning the brain or whatever. I'm like, this kid's a wanker. That's not how they really talk.
Yeah.
So we basically started. We just get rolling with natural convo.
Yeah.
And we do your introduction
In post.
Yeah, that's fine.
Let's start off with your field of research, your credentials, and then maybe the top myths that you hear in your field.
Yeah, so I'm a clinically trained psychologist and have specialised in alcohol and other drugs. I like to call my field of study ethnopharmacology, which is the human relationship with drugs.
Cool.
Because it goes beyond, understanding dependence, addiction, behaviour change, and looking at policy and history, anthropology. I think the issue of alcohol and other drugs extends across multiple disciplines. So it's helpful to have a toolkit of different disciplines to be able to dig out and use depending on what you're looking at.
Yeah. Awesome.
That's a great summation.
Yeah. So what's some of the top myths that you consistently encounter with using alcohol or other drugs for any addiction?
Because this is part of what you do, isn't it? Like with the media watchdog sort of style stuff with the
absolutely.
way it's portrayed. So
I would say probably the biggest myth is that if with certain drugs in particular, things like heroin, methamphetamine, people believe that if you use a drug once, then you'll become dependent on it. You have to use a drug multiple times to become dependent on it. And with drugs like heroin, most people, when they use it for the first time, don't have a pleasant experience. So it's a bit like smoking a cigarette. The first time you smoke a cigarette, it tastes awful, you cough, it gives you a head spin, you have a lie down.
Yeah.
You have to persist to become dependent on tobacco.
Yeah.
You don't just smoke a cigarette and become dependent.
That's always like been so strange to me, because I've found no desire at all. I can't understand the attraction of smoking cigarettes.
No.
You don't get high.
No.
You don't get like a positive experience. You smell, your breath stinks, your teeth go.
It's an image thing, hey?
Yeah.
It's all image.
Like when I was younger, my mate, someone I think passed away, and they were like, have a smoke with him. I'm like, dude, I don't want to. And they were like, just do it. I had a drag, and I'm like, I'm done.
Gives you a headache.
There's no need.
Head spin. And,
Doesn't make any sense to me.
No.
So,
No, but I get what you're saying.
Yeah.
But I guess would you suggest is addiction more? And we spoke about this last night. Last night, is it more like inclined to be like a mask for a hidden problem? Maybe whether it's mental health or traumas or
Look, it can be, and for a number of people that are seeking treatment services for alcohol and other drug use issues, they do have underlying trauma.
Yeah.
Though I try to actually avoid the term addiction. I like to use the term dependence, because dependence is something that's normal. We're all dependent on certain people, objects. Like take away someone's phone and watch them go through withdrawal.
Yeah.
yeah.
But the point is that it's normal, and so there's different degrees of dependence. And I guess if you become too dependent on something, like the phone example, it does start to become pathological at a certain point. So I think that's a more useful way of understanding it, because it's a normal, natural human trait that gets amplified under certain conditions.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. Yeah. So you started your career as psych and then went into the branch of what you're into now, or was it always you had your eye on this pathway and you decided to go down that, or was it something that, like, you're studying and you found it interesting and you're like, oh, I'm going to go in this direction?
Well, the topic of psychedelics was something that came up sort of along the way.
Yeah.
But I did go into psychology with the intention of working specifically with people experiencing dependence from alcohol and other drugs.
Yep.
So my PhD looked at the ways in which the media can frame alcohol and other drug use issues, and how that limits our conversations in society about alcohol and other drugs, because there's certain things that we can't really say in public, even though we might agree in private.
Yeah.
The media has difficulty communicating some of those ideas.
Yeah.
What do you think's behind those reasoning, or is it just the narrative is this, we have to stick to this?
Well, I can give you the short answer, the easy answer, or the long answer.
Well, it's a long
form podcast. So
the longer answer is that there are dominant institutions within society that benefit from the status quo, and they want to maintain power. And so those institutions are things like the medical institutions, so medicine, big pharma. The alcohol industry has a vested interest in maintaining prohibition. They got the market on the intoxicant at the moment. They don't want to lose the capital share of the market.
So it's not a conspiracy?
Oh, I don't think it's a conspiracy. I think it's come about from racist reasons. The reason drugs are prohibited are purely historic. I mean, if alcohol was invented today, there's no way it would be a legal drug. It would be absolutely banned. And when we look at why cocaine and cannabis were banned, it was because of concerns about the use of those drugs by Black Americans and Mexicans. And even in Australia, we banned certain types of opium that were useful for, you could use them for smoking. That was banned in Australia in the late 19th century because of concern about Chinese immigrants in Australia that were stealing Australian jobs, and they were smoking opium. So what better way to discriminate against a particular group than by banning their drug of choice?
I see this with as well, like the people who were protesting, and I think you brought this up in your TED Talk, the people who are protesting, the Vietnam War and that, they're usually all having a bit of LSD, and they felt like this was the way to sort of stamp that out.
Yeah, absolutely. The the prohibition of psychedelic drugs in the late 60s and early 70s by the Nixon government was around the concerns of hippies. They saw that hippies were public enemy number one. They were protesting against the Vietnam War. Things weren't great in the US at the time either, and the Nixon government needed a scapegoat, and so they used hippies. At one point, Timothy Leary was called public enemy number one in the US. I mean, this is just a guy
for studying LSD.
Well, he was doing more than studying it. By that time, he was sort of telling the masses to turn on, tune in, and drop out. So they weren't stoked about that. But surely that's not your public enemy number one.
Yeah. No. So he sort of popularized LSD and that sort of stuff. Was he the one who discovered the effects of it?
No, it was the dude on his bike.
Albert Hoffman.
Yes.
So I love this. Maybe this history part is a great place to start because we've touched on racism, stopping cocaine, marijuana. I'd love to hear a little bit more about what you know about that. And yes, the original story of the bicycle for our listeners that haven't heard Mr. Hoffman's experience. So if you're happy to, we'd love to hear a little bit of the background because it's super interesting.
Yeah, well, we were having a chat just before we started recording about Johann Hari. I mean, he wrote a book that sort of really documents the history of cannabis and cocaine and all of the issues that were trying to be addressed through the prohibition of the drugs. And essentially you also had at that time in the US, I mean, essentially Australia just imports everything from the US, and unfortunately most of the rest of the world has. Yeah. But it's not necessarily been by choice. So in the early 20th century, you had prohibition in the US of alcohol. Yep. Then around that time was when prohibition of the other drugs began to emerge, because when they repealed prohibition, you had this massive organisation that were policing alcohol prohibition. They needed jobs, and so they focused their efforts now onto the other drugs through the prohibition of those drugs.
Okay. So so once the alcohol prohibition ended, they needed to find something else to do.
Yeah, and it's Harry Ainslinger was the fellow that sort of was coordinating all of this, the Bureau of Narcotics, I think they were called in the US, and they went worldwide. They were basically bullying other nations into signing different UN conventions. It wasn't called
That doesn't sound like America. What? They've surely stopped that now, haven't they? If we ask the Ukraine. Gee whiz.
Yeah. So was that the Lost Connections? Was that the book?
It's the one before Lost Connections. I'm trying to think of the name of it. Chasing the Scream.
Yeah, okay. Johann Hari's book. Go and have a read of that one. They're both pretty interesting.
Okay. So then the story of Albert Hoffman. Does that link up?
Well, not really. There was, I guess, in terms of psychedelics, the first real Western exposure to it, I think, would be through mescaline. So Native Americans using peyote, they isolated the active ingredient in it, mescaline. A guy called, I've forgotten his name.
Mr. Mescaline.
But it's essentially, it was through self-experimentation.
Yeah, right.
Is
this a Native American dude or just a white guy that's
white
like, hey,
guy.
they look like they're onto something?
White guy, I think in Europe somewhere. Right. A chemist was looking at the different fractions that could be extracted. So if you use different solvents, you'll get different chemicals out of the source plant material. And so he found a volunteer to try the different fractions until they found the one that sort of went boom.
So is this...
He found a volunteer.
That's incredible, because I've always wondered, like, things like ayahuasca and a few of those sorts of hallucinogenics, how they get the system in place to create it, like figuring out what plants need to be used to inhibit this plant and whatnot. And I guess it's just through trial and error over years and years.
Yeah, I think with ayahuasca, it's fascinating. I don't have an answer as to how they originally discovered that if you mix this plant that does absolutely nothing on its own and you mix this plant that does absolutely nothing on your own, you get a very powerful psychedelic experience.
Part of my conspiracy mind feels like it's leftover knowledge from a previous advanced civilization.
That makes the most sense.
That's how it feels.
Yeah.
It seems to have this gateway into almost another dimension. I'm very interested. I've never partaken at all in any of that sort of stuff, and it's something I'm actually openly very ready to try, I think.
But you're not addicted to anything.
No, well, this is it.
Or
But
dependent.
Well, you've got a coffee there.
Yeah. So while I am dependent on coffee, my thoughts would be like dealing with trauma of you know the separation and certain things like that, and seeing if that's helpful in certain ways. But we can get onto traumas and stuff later on.
Yeah, cool.
But essentially, you know, mescaline was isolated again in the late 19th century. So a long time ago, not much really happened in the psychedelic space until Albert Hofmann. So he was investigating potential medicines for migraine, and he was looking at derivatives of ergotamine, which is contained in ergot fungus. It grows in rye. It's caused a bunch of problems historically where people would experience something they labelled St. Anthony's fire. Basically, people that unintentionally had consumed this ergot fungus would experience severe hallucinations. They assumed these people were possessed or they'd been, bewitched, and then they would die not long after. It would actually kill them. Oh wow! And so he was tweaking the molecular structure of that drug and accidentally exposed himself to a small amount of it. So that initial experience, he didn't feel right. I think he left the lab, went and had a nap. But he had a pretty good idea which drug he'd exposed himself to. So a couple of days later, he went to the lab and intentionally took 250 micrograms of LSD, which we know now is a pretty high dose. But back in those days, nothing was really active below a milligram. So he thought he was being quite cautious. And of course, he had the bicycle day experience. He had a pretty full-on psychedelic experience. From there, the lab he was working for, Sandoz, really just sent it out to researchers around the world to try and figure out what this thing could be used for.
Hey, this guy's tripping dick. Just go figure out what's in it.
I mean, they're a pharmaceutical industry, so they need an indication to use the drug, to treat something with it. So they just sent it out to people hoping someone would find a use for it. Not long after that, Gordon Wasson discovered for the Western world psilocybin mushrooms in Mexico. He was an investment banker. If you look at most people in the US and also Australia and England, we're mycophobic. We don't like mushrooms. We won't just pick a mushroom and eat it. But his wife was from continental Europe, and she would go out mushrooming all the time. Yeah. And he sort of heard about these magic mushrooms and went out in search of them in Mexico. Had a mushroom ceremony with one of the traditional Mexican people, took some of the mushrooms back as samples. Albert Hofmann actually analysed them, extracted psilocybin. So not only did Albert Hofmann discover LSD, he also discovered psilocybin.
Wow. So this dude is like the godfather.
He's the godfather of hallucinogenics.
Yeah. But that blows my mind. Like, if you eat the wrong mushroom, you're dead, right?
Yep.
So she would go out and just pick mushrooms and hope for the best, or she knew what she was doing?
You got to know what you're doing.
Yeah, okay.
And if you grow up in that culture, you get taught that that knowledge early on in life. And I've learned, when I was living in Melbourne, I learned how to go mushrooming for all kinds of mushrooms, but also gourmet ones. Yeah. And a lot of the pine mushrooms don't look like edible mushrooms. They're very distinct. Unless you're told to eat it, there's no way you would pick it to eat. Yeah. But once you know what it is, because it is so distinct, it's very difficult to mix it up with a deadly mushroom. And unfortunately, some of the most deadly mushrooms actually look like the ones you'd buy from Coles or Woolworths. They're the ones that are most likely to kill you, not the weird looking ones.
Yeah. Wow, that's so interesting. So I just want to revert back because I reckon we need to get you on more than once if you enjoy today's experience. Yeah. Because there's so many different avenues. But that St. Elmo's fire thing that you mentioned in their head, and then they would die afterwards, was that because they had too much of whatever that ergot fungus?
It wasn't so much too much of it. It's that it was toxic. So it wasn't only it didn't only have those hallucinogenic effects. It was also a toxic drug.
Right.
Lots of things like LSD are actually the exception to the rule in that, it's very difficult to overdose on LSD. Most other substances, even things like caffeine, can cause overdose because they're essentially toxic. There's a Greek philosopher / medical practitioner in ancient Greece said, the poison maketh the dose. because at the right dose, something's therapeutic. But if you have a large dose, it can cause death. But in this instance, I'm not sure if there is a dose of certainly. So ergotamine, the chemical that Hoffman was working on, is still used today in medicine. So that's a bit different. But there's other chemicals in the fungus that I think that were causing the death part of things.
Okay, that's really interesting. So, and he had 250 micrograms. Sorry, what's a standard LSD dose? Just so the people that don't do it would know how much more he had than normal.
Yeah. So a hit in the 60s was about 100 micrograms.
Yeah.
And these days, a blotter that's going around is probably around 40, 50, maybe if you're lucky, 70 micrograms.
Yeah,
so
if you're lucky or unlucky, depends on how you can handle it. Yeah, right. So he had like nearly 2.5 times the standard dose. So he had a pretty good day on his bike.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, and what was the reason behind he felt like there was benefits to be had by
that's the interesting thing. This guy's just absolutely had the world melt around him. Yeah. And he's like, oh, no, I reckon other people can figure out how we can make this good.
And beneficial, yeah.
I'm not sure if it was his decision or the company Sandoz's decision to send it out worldwide, but I do know, having read his book, LSD, My Problem Child, that he was aware, even on those early experiences with it, that there was something here that was interesting, something potentially therapeutic, but he couldn't sort of put his finger on it. But he clearly thought that it had potential, because not only did he experience LSD with Bicycle Day, he kept on taking LSD after that.
Yeah.
So did he meet with any barriers, any hurdles, or with trying to get people to research it? Yeah.
Well, the early research used the model, it's called the psychomimetic model. It assumed that what these drugs were doing was creating a psychotic experience. But psychosis is quite different to a psychedelic experience. And
well, do you want to outline that for us? Because that's one of those myths that people think, oh, you take acid and you turn into a glass of orange juice, which is what I heard when I was in high school. Had this guy, he thinks he's a glass of orange juice, and he's in Greylands now, and I think that's just a worldwide perpetuated old wives' tale.
Yeah, so one of the more interesting things I've done is volunteer at like trip sitting services at festivals, and so looking after people that are having a challenging experience on
awesome.
a psychedelic
what an interesting
drug.
Job.
And in doing so, you see sort of all kinds of varieties of the psychedelic experience. I was talking with some colleagues there, and the way that you describe it really depends on your field of study. So the toxicologist would just say, oh, it's just an overdose. The person's had an overdose. I would say they're tripping balls. He would say they've had an overdose.
And we'll go you, because you're the professor.
Yeah, a psychiatrist might say that they're having a psychotic break.
Yeah.
So for me, the distinction between a challenging psychedelic experience and psychosis isn't so much the distress, but it's more about the contact with reality. Most people are aware, even when they're having a really challenging time, they're aware that they took a drug. Yeah. And they're aware that what they're experiencing is a consequence of that drug. They feel like they're dying right now. Yeah. But with a bit of assurance and, checking their pulse, checking, even getting someone from paramedicine over just to check out their vital signs, that'll keep them chill for 30 seconds to a minute.
Yeah, but they got 7 hours ahead of them.
That's right. And just reminding them that they have taken a substance and it will wear off. They will come back to baseline, but it's going to be a long ride, and they just need to strap in, hold on, and just ride it out.
That's amazing. That's very much like an anxiety attack, where you're like, I feel like I'm going to die, and you have to remind yourself, like, I'm going to feel normal again.
Yeah, Chelsea's often said, move through it, experience it, be in the anxiety, and then breathe and move through it.
We actually do the same thing with people having a challenging experience. What people are generally doing is that they're trying to avoid that experience. So they're trying to push it away, and the harder that they push it, the worse the experience becomes. And so we get them to try to be curious about what it is that they're trying to avoid and approach it rather than avoid it. And incredible to see people that are in a really challenging mind state within half an hour to an hour sometimes, almost back to baseline, giving you a hug, thanking you, and really haven't done anything. You just sort of held their hand for a little while and encouraged them to approach rather than avoid, helping them to reframe. You know, they're not having a bad trip, they're just having a challenging experience, and they need to ride it out.
That's amazing.
Is this what it's like? And I've not got no experience with it, but the DMT, the letting go, breaking through, I think that's... I feel it's a bit different because with DMT, you don't actually have any connection to where you are at all, from my experience. Yep.
Which is the first time I think I spoke about this on the pod, but whatever.
Allegedly.
Quitting teaching.
Yeah.
I think there's a big difference between the two because with DMT, you literally leave this dimension. You go somewhere else. You can't look down and see your legs and your body. You don't. Well, my experience, and mate, you can probably fix me out. I've only done it once, but my experience was I went somewhere else completely. I had no awareness or there was no Daniel Delby. I was not here. I was in a different place, and it was only when I came back that I was aware that I had a body and I was a human and I was back.
So you didn't have any trouble letting go of that fact?
There was no time. You just get blasted off into space.
That's right. Yeah.
Wow.
You just go somewhere else. Whereas any other form of stimulant or psychedelic, I think you're still hyper aware that you're in a body. You've taken something. You're here. Yes. But with the DMT, it was a disconnect. Does that feel like,
sounds right.
Yeah.
And probably even more of a disconnect with 5-methoxydimethyltryptamine.
Yeah. Okay.
Because my experience with mushrooms is obviously very different. I was fully aware that I was on them, and I played with it. I had fun with it. I didn't do it for the
fun guy.
I didn't do it for the benefits that we can obviously talk about soon. But I did it for fun, and I had a fucking awesome time. It was great. But I was fully aware the whole time that it was.
I think if you go up to a higher dose, then it starts, particularly with psilocybin mushrooms, because psilocybin is essentially orally active DMT. So DMT is not orally active. If you take if you were to orally consume the DMT, the same DMT that you smoke and sends you into space, it does absolutely nothing. You have enzymes in the stomach that breaks it down. Psilocybin is 4-hydroxydimethyltryptamine. So that 4-hydroxy group on it prevents it from being broken down in the stomach, and then it crosses into the blood system and into the brain. But it's essentially orally active DMT. And if you do take it up to a high dose, then it starts to get... Terence McKenna talks about heroic doses of psilocybin, which is starting to get very similar to a DMT experience.
Yeah.
Wow.
Now, I love that advice that you've just said about helping people at a festival that are tripping balls. Is instead of resisting it, just release yourself, give into it, and see where it's going to take you, and see and see why it's so challenging. That's awesome. Have you got any massive stories of other people that you've met that have had some sort of breakthrough when they've decided not to fight it anymore? Or is it more just like, I was struggling and now I'm not?
Yeah, it resolves really quickly. And I've talked to people afterwards, and often they can't even articulate what it was.
Yeah, okay.
Similar to DMT, where you lose that sense of body. People do have ego dissolution with psychedelics, and people often mistake that ego dissolution with actual death. So that's why they feel like they're dying. But once they kind of let go and that passes through, they realise that they're not dying because they're still here. But I've seen people, ask for the phone so they can call their mum to let them know that they're not coming home because they're dying.
So I think that's where probably the negative stereotype comes through, is where they've had those calls and mum thinks that their kid's gone crazy because they're dying, and then it builds that negative reputation.
So why are the barriers in place for because we see these ideas and
because that's ego death, right?
Ego death.
Yeah. And obviously we're not saying that recreational use is the way to go. We're trying to, and we'll go further into the methods that you guys are trying to implement and what we're studying and some legalities that have been sorted. But why do you think this is why is there such a stigma about it?
Yeah.
Well, I think in Western society in general, we're psychophobic. We don't like anything that's psychoactive, excluding alcohol, tobacco, and caffeine.
Yeah, all the legal ones.
All the legal ones are fine, but anything else is dangerous. Cocaine, amphetamine,
Was this a propaganda sort of push by any certain government for any? And then we touched on the racial divides and whatnot, but is there obviously other benefits?
Yeah, I think it must be cultural, because if you go back 150 years or more, like the example with the fellow, the volunteer that took the mescaline, back in those times, there wasn't that stigma associated with psychoactive drugs. And, there used to be, there was parties in England, and I assume in the US too, where people had sampled different volatile solvents, things like laughing gas.
There's still parties like that in Maribuka.
but it was a high class thing. It wasn't sort of your party in Maribuka. This was something the elite were engaging in.
Wow.
So things have
just
changed.
for scientific research, or just for
fun.
just going there and okay, that's really cool. So I guess, I had a story, but I'll tell it if it pops up again.
Okay.
About accepting. Fuck it, I'll just tell you now. So I was in Vegas, and allegedly we got our drink spiked, and it turned out it was LSD. But the guys that spiked the drinks did it so they could rob my friends, and because they were tripping dick. But I'd never ever done anything like that before. So when I realised what was happening, I walked out into the casino floor, and straight away, like, the lights were like, ding dong, ding dong, like coming at me. I was like, fuck, this is like what I've seen on Fear and Loathing. This feels like I'm on acid right now, and I'm like fucking shitting myself. But what you said before, where it's like, strap yourself in, it's going to be a long ride. Friends of mine that had done it before had said to me, when I wanted it to finish, it went for another 12 hours. So luckily I'd had that conversation years before with one of my mates. And if I hadn't had that, I fucking would have checked myself in a hospital, I reckon. But knowing that what was happening was going to last a really long amount of time was such a savior to me. But I ended up it's pretty hectic. I ended up going back to the penthouse, and this pimp was trying to fight me while I was tripping on acid because he was robbing my friends, and I brought it up to my friends that you're getting robbed right now, and they were just laughing. They didn't give a fuck. And then when I left the hotel, I was like, Quick's going to, his name was Quick, the pimp. He's going to shoot me. So I gave it legs from the hotel, and as I got back to my hotel room, I tried to have a drink out of the tap, and I couldn't. And I'm like, oh my God, like, I'm done here. I don't know how to use a tap. And then I ordered room service, and then they called me back and they said, we can't bring you your pizza and water. The gas is out. And I'm like, does that mean that the water doesn't work? And they were like, yes. I was like, oh my God, thank you so much. Thank you so much. So it turned out that I knew how to use a tap. It just was turned off. But I've really, really shortened that story for the pod. I'll tell it like on a deeper level later. But knowing from that point until after, that was like a good 14 hours later.
So do like moments like that, for example, do they obviously promote the stigma about it, I guess, because the stuff that you're working on is the
complete opposite.
Yeah, is doing it in a controlled environment, doing it correctly.
Yeah, but we tell people what they're having. If you're being spiked, you're not consenting to it for a start.
That's right. Yeah, and you're not aware what's happening to you is potentially caused by something not in your system.
But then also, and people will see these people being idiots, fucking running around being crazy, and then go, oh, that's what fucking drugs do to you. Yeah. Whereas, again, you're talking about a very controlled environment, trying to get benefits out of it, trying to grow from it, trying to help ease traumas, and just trying to find
addiction,
or dependence, not addiction. All of these sorts of things, I guess, is that where you're moving towards now, trying to, because obviously the studies are they starting to ease up now?
Oh no, it's blowing up more than ever.
Yeah, okay.
There's so much happening, I can't keep up with it anymore.
Yeah, that's a good thing, right?
Yeah, I think it is. I think it's I think there's two sides to it. I think it's a good thing in terms of challenging the stigma, which we're talking about at the moment. Yeah. But at the same time, with that example with people seeing somebody under the influence having, doing silly shit. People do that on alcohol all the time.
Yeah.
And we seem to be fine with that. even we were talking about the myths before. One of the myths I don't know if it's how strong it is now, but certainly a few years ago was the methamphetamine epidemic. But if you went to a hospital on any given Friday night, it was full of people pissed. There was probably a couple of cases of amphetamine psychosis, but it was primarily people that were drunk. So I find that really interesting that we have that stigma towards we have such a strong stigma towards these drugs that we don't really look at the evidence. And I feel like one of the reasons that those myths are perpetuated is because it lets everybody that drink off the hook. It's like, alcohol's not fine. It's these other drugs that are dangerous. Drugs are bad, but alcohol's fine.
And having seen that sort of situation play out in within, I won't say who, but within a close part of my life, seeing the stigma around what's happened to them and not knowing the traumas that have caused those issues, specifically with meth, and then seeing that those same people who are judging them for that have a huge dependence on alcohol and don't see the hypocrisy, and a really bad dependence on alcohol, it becomes embarrassing for them. So I feel like there is that stigma, like it's okay to be drunk out of your fucking mind, but not.
Not only is it okay, it's encouraged.
Yeah.
When you turn 18 or 21, you drink a yardie. The manhood ritual in Australia is you get really drunk, pass out, get your eyebrows shaved off, and then you're a man.
Do you think it's because you're able to function a little more with an alcohol dependence as opposed to a meth dependence?
Well, I've met people that can use methamphetamine functionally in the same way people can use alcohol functionally.
Ben Cousins run a Brownlow.
I mean,
super functional.
I actually find his story really, really fascinating when, Seven are trying to use his story to talk about how bad drugs are. And the message I get is exactly that. Here, kids, you can use drugs and win a Brownlow and do all these other awesome, amazing things.
Until later in life when you've taken your footy away.
So, and obviously there is a thing we don't want to say, all drugs are good and using them, and like we spoke about, any sort of substance can be abused and turned into a lethal dose. Even water, I think you can drown.
Absolutely,
your liver
you can drown from water,
from drinking too much water.
100% of drownings are caused by water.
But you can drown your own liver and drown yourself by drinking too much water.
The dose maketh the poison, water included.
So maybe moving from the recreational, I've got one more question I want to ask, but then we can look into how other drugs are being used in your field, like to treat things, like what are some of the benefits and all that. But before I forget, mescaline, it doesn't seem like it's that popular when people talk about psychedelics. You often hear about psilocybin and LSD or acid. We don't really hear too much about mescaline. Is that because it's an Australian thing, or is that because the trips aren't as great as LSD and mushrooms? Because, I don't hear too much.
I think there's a few reasons. If you go to the US, mescaline's almost a gourmet drug. People seek out mescaline, but it's quite hard to find. One of the reasons it's hard to find is it's kind of a niche drug, so people aren't synthesizing it from scratch. And if you're extracting it from cactus, you need a lot of cactus to be able to extract enough mescaline. So most mescaline use in Australia is through people just eating the cactus itself. Yeah. And it's a bit like ayahuasca. It doesn't taste great. It can cause nausea because of the other alkaloids that are in the cactus. Yep. And you got to eat a lot of cactus to have a strong psychedelic experience. So I think that's partly why we don't hear about it. It also has a really, really delayed onset, so it takes about up to 2 or 3 hours to kick in. Yep. But it's actually quite a nice psychedelic, say for a multi-day festival, because it lasts longer than LSD. It's similar to LSD in that it's you want to be outdoors, you want to be engaging in nature. Yep. Whereas, your experience with mushrooms might be different, but with a high dose of mushrooms, people generally don't want to go outdoors. They just want to be in a dark room with their eyes closed with some music.
They become a mushroom. Okay, cool. So, the mescaline, is it true that the plant or the cactus that the mescaline grows on is potentially endangered because people are seeking it out and it takes a long time to grow?
Yeah, so there's more than one type of cactus that contains mescaline. The one you're talking about is peyote, and that has become endangered, and it's become a really complex situation in the US and northern Mexico where it grows, because you've got the Native American church that are allowed to not only harvest peyote but use it within the context of the church. There's other people that have Native American heritage that are using it outside of the church, who are concerned about the preservation of it, the conservation of it. And then so they're kind of clashing with each other, those two groups. Then on top of that, you've got, Westerners, white people coming in, trying to sort out the situation as well. So they're trying to grow it in greenhouses and give it to folks from the Native American church who won't take it because it hasn't grown in the ground.
Wow.
And so it's quite a messy, complex situation.
Messy killing.
The interesting thing is that there are cactuses that grow a lot quicker than peyote that contain significant amounts of mescaline as well. And I see them growing around Perth. Some very big ones too. And again, they were actually used traditionally in South America where they grow natively. But again, in the Native American church, they see that it's they have a story around the peyote and how the first person discovered the psychoactive effects and the spiritual properties of it. So they have a really, really close relationship with the peyote. So we can't, suggest that they start consuming San Pedro or one of these other sorts of cacti because it doesn't fit with their spiritual beliefs.
The interesting...
That's the most ultimate Adam and Eve story ever. It's like Adam just found a cactus and started going.
It was actually Eve. It was a female.
Oh, was
story,
it?
Yeah.
Sweet. Can you tell us it?
I don't know it that well. My best version of it would be that she was... I don't know how she had become lost from the rest of her group. And I'm not sure if it was before or after the colonization of the US. I think it was after colonization. So this, Native Americans become a very marginalized group. They actually weren't using peyote that much at the time. And there was a story about this young girl. I say girl, she's probably a young woman that had become isolated from the group, was trying to find her way back to the group. She was, experiencing dehydration, starvation, and she kind of fell down to the ground in front of a peyote cactus, and the cactus spoke to her and told her to eat it, and then once she ate it, then told her to take it back to her people, and it will save her it will save her people.
Wow.
So before we move into that area of the medical benefits and stuff, I want to just quickly get your thoughts on the similarities between certain psychedelics and the meeting of certain entities, and across the different sort of areas of the globe having very similar encounters. Yeah. Like, it does prod the idea that there's something else. It's almost like a gateway to another dimension. Is that something like you think is a possibility, or is there like what are your thoughts on what's happening there? Because it does feel very strange that people have the same experience.
It's from different cultures, different language, different everything, but
see the same entities.
Yeah.
It's a hard one.
It's a hard one because it's like, is that ingrained as a
scientist
human?
in me says that it's the brains are very similar, so maybe it's not that surprising that people are going to have similar experiences. If you give somebody cocaine, everybody feels good.
Yeah.
So it might be that there's existing brain structures. A psychodynamic clinician or psychoanalyst might say it's psychological archetypes that are being activated. So we're seeing these different psychological archetypes. All the way through to the other end of the spectrum would be that our brains are like antenna, and we're picking up consciousness through that antennae, a bit like a TV picks up, the reception, and then you see it on the screen. Yeah. So there's quite a wide variety of explanations.
Yeah, because that does make sense as well. I always feel like there's this sort of blend between spirituality and science. I think there's almost a scientific reason behind spiritual enlightenment and all these sorts of things, but because of the lack of understanding, we just call it a spiritual or religious experience. I still think there's science behind all of those sorts of concepts.
Yeah, well, I mean, I like probably the distinction I make between spiritual and religious is spiritual is the experience somebody has, or the way that they, looking up at the stars and having gratitude for the massive universe we live in is a spiritual experience, whereas religion is when you start imposing dogma and rule onto that experience. And so if we look at the church, one of the reasons the church opposes the use of psychedelics, you go to the church to talk to God through the priest. They don't like the idea that you can just take some mushrooms and dial a direct line to God.
Yeah, skip the priest.
And therein lies that sort of blend between religion and science, where I sort of feel like perhaps sometimes the spiritual things that you see or have those experiences are just trips, are just, taps into that sort of way of the consciousness is the way the brain's working.
There's a type of epilepsy that causes visions very similar to their experience. There's like a spiritual encounter. And if we go through history of cases where people have had spiritual experiences, it's been hypothesized that they've suffered from temporal lobe epilepsy, which causes these types of experiences.
So Joan of Arc was just epileptic.
Exactly, yeah.
Wow, that's insane. How do I grow that?
You don't really want it. You don't really want epilepsy.
Yeah.
And then I guess we move into the medical benefits and what we're trying to do with it, and what you guys are, or the world is trying to.
Maybe if we hear some trials that have been successful, how you've used microdosing to treat addiction, or anything that we probably, the listeners wouldn't have heard before, or just start at like the basics, like, hey, we've had success treating depression with magic mushrooms or MDMA or whatever.
It's just, as you're talking, I'm just going, there's so many different pathways to go down.
Yeah,
just before going down any of them.
Whatever you like and whatever's interesting to you is going to be
I guess one of the things I'd say, just to close off that conversation, is I actually don't have an issue with people using any substance for whatever intention they have. And that's it, it's intention. You mentioned you use mushrooms for fun. We have different intentions. But essentially what we're doing when we're using these in the context of psychotherapy is just coming in with a different intention. But yeah, I don't have an issue with people.
Is that the same way as almost meditating? You can set an intention and you can almost have like a psychedelic experience if you meditate correctly and get the right
100%. If one way of sort of talking about the two, because brain scans show that they're very similar. There's some recent research where they give people that are expert meditators psychedelics to look at how it impacts on their meditation practice. And one way of understanding it is meditation is like climbing Mount Everest. It's hard work, or you can take a psychedelic, get a helicopter to the top, check it out, and come back down again.
Yeah, that's exactly how that's the part in my brain where I'm like, I should just have DMT or I should just have mushrooms, but the part of me wants to put the work in and do the right effort into my meditating. But
that's you bringing your own values in, like what is the right.
Yeah, it's exactly right. I feel like if I can do it myself, if it's within me already, I can try and access that myself.
And some theologians, support your idea as well. They would say that the psychedelic experience is artificial. It's not real. And if you do that hard work of climbing the mountain, then you'll get the real, genuine, and authentic version of the spiritual experience.
But if the endpoint's the same.
Yeah, well, that's true. I think, but people like, for example, Russell Brand, who's sober, but very open to these sorts of ideas and concepts. He uses a certain sort of breath work, Kundalini breathing, I think, to try and get the same sort of experiences himself. I think I've heard people take the piss out of him saying there's no way you can have the same. But I have heard that the experiences can be very similar through Kundalini breath work.
Lots of different breath work can create very similar experiences. It's interesting. If you look at people like Ram Dass that were working with Timothy Leary, that wasn't his original name, but then he went to Tibet and became a monk and got right into meditation because he believed that, he said that he could get into those same states through using meditation. So there's a long history of people that have been interested in psychedelics and then moved into meditation or other contemplative practices because they've realized that they can get to that same state without having to take a psychedelic drug.
It's cheaper.
I guess the one common aspect that I can see with any sort of psychedelic that I've ever taken has been this sort of detachment from myself and more of I feel part of a bigger connection to everything, and also just how insignificant I am within the whole aspect of the universe. That's the feeling I get every time I have it. I have this almost this feeling that every infinite piece of the universe is all within my body, experiencing what I'm experiencing, and almost laughing at this primitive form trying to experience the universe. That's the feeling I'm left with every time I have it. I feel like Delby or an alien or a cat is almost inside my body.
I am inside you sometimes.
Yeah, experiencing what I am experiencing. And the higher entities, I feel, are just laughing, going, this meat sack is just weird the way it, but it's cool for them to experience. That's how I feel. That's a strange feeling.
There are ways of measuring that. So there's mystical state questionnaires, and it kind of breaks down the psychedelic experience in terms of its mystical qualities into, I think it's 4 domains. So one is that sense of connectedness. You know, all is one. We're all interconnected. Another is ineffability, that you can't talk, like you can't accurately describe that feeling. It's just kind of a feeling, and you can't really use words to describe it.
I tried my best then, and it felt like I rambled a bit, but it's very, it's hard to define that feeling. It's
what's the other two?
I'm trying to think what they are. One is a sense of like reverence, that it's something a sacredness feeling about it, and I'm trying to think what the third is. I should know this, but I can't think of it.
So it's called the mystical questionnaire.
Yeah, mystical states questionnaire.
Mystical states questionnaire. Well, I had a very extremely similar experience from mushrooms. I had a couple of weeks ago, and it was pretty funny. There's 2 things. The first thing was I've had 5 back operations, like a super bad back pain. I tore my rotator cuff as well a few years ago. And while I was on the shrooms, when I closed my eyes, I was sent back, and I don't know why, but it was to all I can describe as some Amazonian place. There was I could hear drum beats. I could see some form of Amazonian people. And then my back, I started getting a shock that would go like electricity from my brain through to my back. And where my surgery and where my pain was, it would click out, like it wouldn't connect in, it was clicking out. And each click got more and more intense and started spasming right where my surgery and my pain was. And then it seized up. And in the moment of seizing up, everything went, the only word I can describe is like brilliant. Like the light was like brilliant. And there was this black pain serpent that came. And it was like, I'm here to take your pain. I'm here to take your pain away. And I'm like, and it was blocking this door. I'm like, can I see what's in there? It's like, no, you can't see. I'm taking the pain away. And each time my back would seize up, the snake would be more brilliant and shining. And it's like, I'm taking your pain. So I was like, all right, take it. And then it took my pain and my back stopped hurting. And I was like, what the fuck? And then about 20 minutes later, my shoulder started going where I tore my rotator cuff, and that seized up. And the serpent came back. It's like, I've come to take your pain again. I'm like, all right, just take the pain, you know. It was this brilliant, awesome experience. And then the next day I found out I had COVID, and COVID is like meant to be spasms. So I don't know if that was my brain interpreting what was happening or if it was COVID or whatever. So that was my first experience. And then the second one, like there's lots, like it was so fun. I saw this other dimension, and jesters were like playing pranks on me. But the whole time they were laughing at me, they were actually secretly doing work on me. And they were like, look how great we are. We're working on you. And you don't even know, you know. And then I had this moment in the shower where I had a fungus, I'd been running and had a really bad fungal infection under my armpit. And it was burning. And the mushrooms told me, it's like, hey man, this is just a living thing. It's not meaning you pain. Ask it to leave. So I'm talking to my fucking armpit in the shower going, hey guys, like, I know that you're just like living and you're trying to do your thing, but you're causing me a lot of pain. Could you please just leave? And I'm by myself. So I start laughing because I'm like, what are you doing, bro? Yeah. Then my brain's like, oh my God, the mushrooms, the fungus is asking you to talk to a fungus. And I'm like having this revelation, and I'm imagining the water washing it away. And then I laugh so much because I'm like, the fungus is making me talk to fungus. And I drop down. Yeah. And at the bottom of my shower, I see black fungus on the side of and I'm like, wow, like the fungus wants me to communicate with everything. It's told me to talk to my fungus so I can look at this other fungus. And I'm like, this is amazing. I'm having this profound experience. And then the mushrooms and the jesters were like, ha ha ha, no, you're not. You're not special. Look at you. You think that you're this special person. You think you figured life out and your trip is unique. You're not unique. Everyone has stuff like this. And I'm looking at the toilet with the lid up going, you think you figured out the meaning of life. You're on the floor in your shower talking to mold, looking at a toilet. It's like, you're not special. And I had lost it laughing. I was crying. I was like, I'm not special. This is... That was a massive ego death. And I was like, this is so good. And then I felt completely connected to everyone. I'm like, everyone's the same. We all have like trips. And it was this awesome like ego death.
And that's a common like description, not exactly your scenario, but that's a common description of feeling at the end of it, this death of ego. This total...
Not being special.
Yeah.
Well, and I was in it with everyone.
Yeah,
so.
because if you've had the ego death and you are the same as everybody else, then you're not special.
That's right.
And in turn, maybe that you then start behaving towards other people differently, because if I am you, then I should treat treat you like I would treat myself. Yeah, which is kind of the golden rule of all religions.
I think it is. That is literally called the golden rule: treat others as you want to be treated.
Yeah,
and it is a very because it is like I might get angry at Delby or Delby might get angry at me, but instead of yelling at them, what you'd really want is like, hey, seek a bit of understanding and compassion. I've just had a cunt of a day. You know, like that's maybe what you need. And then that's how I now try to, you lose your shit sometimes, then you catch yourself and breath.
Yeah. The main reason I did them as well for people listening is because like my life was hectic. I've had the most intense last year, like from teaching.
It's been a big one.
It's been huge. And I was getting really uptight. And even Branchy, when he meditated, he was telling me, Delb's like, you need to let go. Mm-hmm. And as I was on the mushroom,
it was screaming at me in my meditations. Tell Delby, let go. The screaming.
Well, it's interesting you use those choice of words because in my mushroom trip, for a good hour and a half, they were screaming at me, let go, like screaming, let go. And I'd had a bet on the footy, and I was like, I'll check it. And then they're like, who gives a fuck? It's just, who cares? Let go. And since then, after that next few weeks, I was like, who cares? Let go. Like, whatever, man. Like, who gives a fuck? It was a really good, like, release. And even with having a bet on the footy, I won so much money because I didn't care. If that makes any sense. I was like, whatever. Let go. Like, my brother messaged me when I was on shrooms, and he's like, oh, man, I fucking lost $20. I was like, who gives a fuck?
Yeah.
Who cares, man? Let go. And he's like, what are you on about? I'm like, the mushrooms are telling me to tell you, let go. So it was great. It was like a really, really, really profound and great experience for me. But I feel like such a wanker saying like, oh, it was so profound and I let go, but it was awesome.
But again, with that being so common and a lot of benefits, that would be perceived as a beneficial sort of experience. And you've mentioned this in your TED Talk that the minority of experiences are dangerous or poor experiences, and those are the ones we focus on. Instead of focusing on the benefits. So now, how are we implementing the benefits, and how is that sort of and what, like, for example, let's start with the specific topic of PTSD, and that can be with any specific sort of field, but PTSD and
is that your special, because you're dependences, aren't you? But have you looked into that
as well? Do a bit of everything.
Yeah, okay, cool.
I would say with PTSD that psilocybin may not be the best therapeutic tool. So we're using MDMA as a way of treating PTSD because MDMA is not a psychedelic. It's empathogenic. You know, people feel empathy. They also feel empathy for themselves, and it's actually hard to describe the treatment because it's quite different, and it relies on everybody in the room understanding that the medicine's kind of doing the job, and the person that's consumed it, the patient, has an inner healing intelligence, a bit like what you were just describing, and that what they need to do is to kind of tune into their inner healing intelligence, and that will kind of tell them what to do, which is very different to any sort of other psychotherapy type work, where it is quite non-directive. And because of the nature of MDMA, it allows people to revisit their trauma in a way that's not re-traumatizing them. I think with psilocybin, there's the potential for people to actually become re-traumatized by re-experiencing that trauma.
Right. And it's because it's the love drug, right? You feel love and empathy and compassion and you want to be like in a loving state.
And you feel connection with people because of that. And what we see with PTSD is people become disconnected because they feel like they're not able to have that relationship with other people anymore. And going back to that point around, is drug dependence being caused by trauma? One thing that some people do if they're experiencing PTSD, because they can't build relationships with other people, they start building the relationship with the substance. They end up having a strong dependent relationship with that substance.
That's interesting. It's like marijuana on Half-Baked. He's got the relationship with Mary Jane.
Yeah.
And how are you implementing the MDMA? Like, how is that being used? And what, like, is it microdosing, I'm assuming?
No. 120 milligrams,
Okay.
Solid dose.
And then within a controlled environment?
Or is in a hospital setting.
Okay.
So
I feel like that would suck. Being in a hospital setting on MDMA.
Well, do you know that the whole thing kind of sucks? It's not... I went into this having, looked after people at festivals. And at the time, I could have gone down, the psilocybin route or the MDMA route. And I was thinking, a colleague had picked up the psilocybin route, and I thought, I'm glad I'm doing MDMA because it's far more predictable. Psilocybin's
That's
so
how
unpredictable.
I feel when I'm on it. I'm glad I'm doing MDMA.
I've seen people at festivals that they're having a great time. You don't really look after people that are having a difficult time on MDMA, particularly on its own.
Yeah.
But having then started to see it in the context of therapy, people are not having a good time because they're re-experiencing their trauma. They're doing really hard work.
On MDMA?
Yeah, on MDMA.
Really? Wow.
So they're crying.
So what's happening there? Like,
this is super
within the brain and
the MDMA turns off the sort of fear response, which allows the person to re-experience the trauma in a way that's not re-traumatizing. And there's other drugs that do that. Alcohol. If you've got someone with PTSD that can't talk about their trauma because they just can't talk about it.
Yep.
If you fill them full of alcohol, they'll talk about the trauma, but they can't reprocess it. So because alcohol just kind of scrambles the brain. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So MDMA is quite unique, and not only is it doing that, it also turns on parts of the prefrontal cortex, particularly associated with language. So people are able to articulate more clearly than they ever could exactly what was going on. And as they're articulating it, because it's not scrambling the brain, they're able to then sort of file away that traumatic experience where it would normally go in memory rather than where it's sitting in sort of the emotional memory or the somatic memory, the body memory.
That's brilliant. That's amazing. So that's interesting to hear that they're crying and having a tough time. Is that just because they haven't faced that fear before? Or is that just a random effect that...
I actually don't know.
Sure.
They're going in with a very different... We talked about intention. They're going in with the intention of treating their trauma. They're not going in with an intention of having fun. And I think the intention, whether it's MDMA, LSD, or alcohol, the intention makes a big difference. Even with alcohol, think about drinking at a funeral versus drinking at a wedding. The intention's quite different. The experience becomes quite different as a consequence.
Now, and how do you measure that? Like, your intention is such a like unmeasurable.
I was going to say, is there any guidance from you guys, like any kind of NLP or any kind of hypnosis state or something that you try and guide them into setting the intention, or do you just go, hey, what do you want to fix? Set your intention. Like, how do you lead into that drug taking?
Yeah, we
medicine taking, I should call it.
Yeah, well, drug taking medicine, either's fine, because I think talking about it as drug taking maybe chips away at some of the stigma.
Yeah.
But really, the intention setting is just done through like normal talk therapy, where it's negotiated with the team that are involved. And the person's encouraged, have a bit of a think about it, go sit under a tree, think about what your intention's going to be, articulate that intention. They might bring an object with them, particularly in psilocybin therapy. They're encouraged to bring an object with them that represents their intention. So when they are having that challenging experience, or if they're kind of having a lot of fun, they're encouraged to connect with the object that they've brought in to help ground themselves back into that intention.
It's like Inception.
And what's the
spinning top?
Is there a science behind the thoughts of having an intention, or is it just like that seems to be what's working?
That's kind of the way it was done in the 60s, and it seemed to have worked back then. And we've just sort of picked up where things left off and are continuing that now.
It's strange that something so quote unquote unscientific as just thinking about something or grounding yourself, or that is used in a scientific field, really, and it's again almost an unmeasurable baseline, but it's also, if it works, it works.
Yeah, and that's actually been one of the criticisms, even within the field, has been this lack of a scientific approach. So, there's some concerns among some experts around the mystical state that we've talked about, like whether we should try to separate the mystical state from the therapeutic effect, rather than drawing into it. Because if we're drawing into it, we might be biasing people to have that mystical experience. So, of course...
And not figuring out why it's happening.
Yeah, because we know that people that have the stronger mystical experience generally get better. They have better prognosis. So now people are trying to really induce that mystical experience through setting up the room in the particular way, through having people set that intention. But the criticism of that is, are we kind of biasing what's going on rather than taking a scientific approach?
Yeah, because if you know that breaching the mystical state helps, then you're more inclined to lead them there rather than them get there on their own. And yeah, that's super interesting. The other question I had for leading in with the state and the object, my mystical state's gone.
Well, actually, I was going to ask.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, it was, you mentioned that's what they did in the 60s. There was a massive stop and massive halt on all psychedelic therapeutic treatments, even for MDMA, hey?
Yeah, well, MDMA wasn't being used until the late 70s, so it kind of it emerged after psychedelics were banned.
Yeah.
Probably some of the therapists that were using psychedelics were introduced to MDMA, and that it was completely legal at the time, like it was when psychedelics were being used legally as psychotherapeutic treatments.
Yeah.
And then, what happened with MDMA is patients became aware that this is an interesting, fun drug. Maybe this would be good outside of the therapeutic setting, and it took off very quickly, of course, because it is, a fun drug to use outside of therapy as well.
Do they have the psychologist on MDMA as well? Because you know how there's that more connecting feeling when people are on it together.
Not generally, no.
Yeah.
It's generally a rule of thumb to be sober when you're sitting with somebody. Even with the trip sitting services, you have to agree that you're going to turn up on the day sober. They don't mind if you're doing stuff on other days, but on the day you turn up, you have to be sober. And it's really not necessary. In fact, I think you I do have mixed ideas on this, but essentially I do think it is important for the person that's holding the space to be sober and grounded, so that they're not, because if they're experiencing the same drug experience as the other person, they can get caught up in that and sort of go down all kinds of rabbit holes that they weren't intending on doing if they were sober.
Because I feel like it's almost a frequency where, like, if someone's on MDMA, like if I'm out and I see someone off chops, I'm like there, or even someone drunk, I struggle with social anxiety going to a pub sober, because if everyone's drunk, I feel like there's this disconnect in the frequency that we're all on, and I'm like, I got to leave this place. And I found like when people are on M and other people are on M, they're like almost on the same frequency and they connect better. But I mean, if you're trying to deliver a psychological service, I guess it would make sense that you don't want to get caught up in your own, like take the path somewhere that's probably not where you would if you were sober, I guess.
And to use that example, so from your subjective experience, it doesn't feel like you're tapping into that same frequency.
Yeah.
If you ask the person that's on MDMA, they'll think that you're tapping into the same frequency.
Gotcha. Right, yeah. We're so connected right now.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You're going, no, we're not.
Yeah.
That vibe, you were like, oh, I'm vibing with you. We're on this, vibe.
Such a vibe. Yeah. And how do you, now, like I had a look at your resume almost, and there's a bunch of studies that you're involved in, and you get, there's like 75 grand for a study on MDMA and this and that. How do you secure the funding, and like what kind of security measures are in place to stop people taking their MDMA out and getting robbed or... whatever.
So the MDMA trial that we're doing at the moment in Perth is running on the smell of an oil rag. It's clinicians donating their time, the hospital donating a bed. So it's Abbotsford Private Hospital. They've
That's
been
my
really
psych.
good.
That's where I go for my ADHD.
So it's through the goodwill of everybody involved in that study. MAPS, which is the leading organisation worldwide driving the research on MDMA, they provided us with the MDMA for free. They provided us with the training for free. So it is goodwill. In terms of the MDMA and security, it's stored in a separate safe to the other drugs in the pharmacy. We had to install a separate safe just to store the MDMA in.
Yeah.
And
what was the code for that?
it's the key.
Yeah.
But there's a chain of custody required. It's the same if you're dealing with, say, an opiate drug or dexamphetamine or something like that. It kind of has to be treated the same way as that drug.
Yeah. And what are the trials? What are the other patients, people with dependence issues or PTSD or
PTSD?
Okay.
And so we've got numbers and stats to show the benefits improving, and like how do you measure happiness or an improvement in mental health?
With PTSD, there are scales of PTSD symptomology, and so essentially the research we're doing in Perth is not to demonstrate whether it works or not. They're doing that elsewhere in the world, and the research shows that when you pull the data together of multiple studies, or they've recently completed a phase 3 trial, which is kind of the last trial before something comes to market, that 2 out of 3 people have a response such that they no longer meet criteria for PTSD after the treatment.
Right.
So that's kind of the evidence of efficacy. I think I think one of the
That's pretty good.
It is good. I think one of the things that gets missed though in communicating that statistic is 1 in 3 people aren't getting better, and some of those people may actually be getting worse. And I would actually like to see a bit more research done on the 1 in 3 people to figure out why it's not working on those people. If they're getting worse, do they have any other comorbid conditions that are contributing to that? Is it their personality type? Because if we do want to roll this out as a mainstream treatment, we not only have to understand how it works, but we have to minimise the adverse effects from those people that it's not working on.
That's a great point. That's a brilliant point. I never even thought about that. And that's what yeah.
So you brought up MDMA and obviously like the empathy aspect. I've heard that weed has a difference in like cognitive empathy.
Cannabis. So our producer Jamal has thrown in. He said that MDMA has an empathetic thing, but cannabis has a different kind of empathetic.
I actually don't
response.
know.
Not sure.
I've heard that before, and I couldn't understand what they meant in the differences between cognitive empathy. I just thought maybe.
I haven't come across that.
Yeah.
Sorry for interrupting.
No, that's all right. It's good. That's that's what stoners just say to justify it. So do you work with cannabis as well, actually, on that point?
Yeah, we do.
Yeah.
I'm doing a clinical trial of a cannabis extract that's higher in CBD than THC for the treatment of methamphetamine use disorder.
Wow. What's a methamphetamine use disorder? Is that what dependence on meth is? Or?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So somebody that's experiencing significant harm in multiple dimensions of their life. And we're not looking at it, I guess, we're not actually looking at it to treat it per se, but to prevent relapse. Because methamphetamine, I keep coming back to smoking, it's quite similar in that people will give up smoking and say, it's easy, I've done it 100 times. Meth is the same. It's easier to stop, but it's hard to stay stopped.
Yeah.
And so we're trying to prevent relapse back to methamphetamine in this group.
Yeah.
Is it a combination of using the drug itself to help with its benefits, but then also addressing the issues that were perhaps causing the traumas that they were dealing with themselves? So
with this trial, we're not doing any other treatment other than what they'd normally get at the treatment service. They're just getting some medical cannabis to take away and to sort of take as prescribed. The other aspects of the treatment service deal with that. And the idea is that the medical cannabis may improve their sleep, the physiological symptoms that psychotherapy and social work can't support them with.
Yeah.
I often find, and maybe this is just individual to me, but with cannabis, I always feel a little slow, brain fog the next day. I don't feel hungover. I don't feel sick. I don't feel like you do with alcohol. I feel completely functional, but I just feel a little off, a little slower. Is that an issue when you're trying to deal with these sorts of things, if you're using it as in a medical way and trying to improve their mindset?
With the study we're doing, because it's mainly CBD, not THC, that slowness he gets from the THC.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, well, that makes sense.
Yeah. What interests you? What's your biggest, what excites you the most about the field that you're in? Do you have like a specific topic that you love the most, or do you like branching out? What's your thing that gets your juices going?
Yeah, I think I like to have multiple things on the go, because I find that within different areas, sometimes you might hit a dead end, or sometimes, like with the psychedelic space, sometimes things just freak me out a little bit too much with what's going on. Like at the moment, there is so much happening. There's so much hype around it, so much money being thrown into it.
Yeah.
That there are companies that are trying to patent mushrooms so they can make money out of them and sell them as antidepressants. Like that's freaking me out now. I want to rein it in and go focus on something else. Come back to that and see if it resolves itself yet.
Yeah, right. So it freaks you out because they're trying to monetize something that occurs naturally, or is that like it freaks you out because it's too good that they're trying to make it an antidepressant, or?
Well, the data. So Compass Pathways is the company, the main company that gets bad press because how can you patent something that's naturally occurring in a mushroom?
Yeah.
Their initial data it's good, but it's not great.
Right.
What worries me is the interface between these drugs and a capitalist society. Like if you think about the way these things were used traditionally, they were used in the context of a community that was supporting them. That was, it was normalized. It was part of the culture. We're trying to force fit this into a capitalist Western culture, and I worry about how that it may not end well if we keep going down that pathway of trying to force fit it into a capitalist culture. Because if we keep heading down this pathway in 10 years from now, when these things do start being rolled out, it'll all be about cost saving. So can we do a little bit less psychotherapy? Can we do it in a group environment? There's going to be ways of trying to cut down the cost, so that people can maximize profit. That worries me.
Yeah, I like that. This is awesome. Yeah.
I think, and this is an issue a grudge I had to bear with the whole. I'm not against capitalism, but when profit is the priority, not the benefit of all, I feel like there's an issue. And that's where things start to become a little bit shady, and profits become a priority over fixing everyone.
Yeah, I'm not anti-capitalist either. I just worry, I think this is an issue not just for psychedelics, but for all drugs. I'm for the regulation of all drugs. I don't think treating it as a crime is particularly useful, whether it's cannabis, even meth. It would be far better to just regulate the whole lot of them, with different levels of regulation depending on the potential harm of the drug.
Yeah.
But if we do that in a hyper-capitalist way, we're going to end up, with billboard signs saying, come and buy cannabis from the pharmacy, or come and buy some mushrooms from here. You're going to be getting Google ads for meth.
Yeah.
It's going to make things worse rather than better if it's not done with the appropriate regulations over it. It's far easier to turn down the regulations. So if we look at tobacco, for example, the last 20 years, we've seen all of these regulations. Each time Australian government puts further regulations on tobacco, the tobacco companies try suing the government. There's all kinds of legal action that takes place because clearly they want to keep making money out of selling tobacco. And they know that, that advertising it to young people, getting customers early, these are all important things. They don't want to lose those tools, so they're pushing back. But but if we say with cannabis, if we had a recreational market, maybe just as a completely out there idea that the government was actually growing the cannabis.
Yeah.
The government doesn't have an interest in selling any more cannabis or any less cannabis, and they're paying for the healthcare bills. So if people are getting unwell because of cannabis smoking, that's not in their interest either. So they want to look after people, provide them with cannabis that's been grown in a way that's doesn't contain contaminants and things like that. Yeah. And it's in their interest to remove the black market so that they're not going to price it too high because they want to ensure that it doesn't create a new black market. And their interest is in, you know, reducing the deficit, all of that economic stuff.
Yeah. It'll be if we do get hyper-capitalist, I will start off your Facebook.com. We can set up some marketing space. But I guess we'll move, because what have we gone? Nearly hour 20. We don't want to hold you up too long. We'd love to get you back on. We obviously can't cover everything in one hit, but something that really spiked our attention that you do is that media watch, which we mentioned earlier on. Like, you're part of a media watch group that tries to, is it the aim to try and make sure that the media aren't spreading disinformation or fear mongering, or you're keeping them in check? What's the word I'm looking for? The motive behind that group, and what do you aim to do there?
Yeah, look, I'll tell you the sort of story of how it came about.
Yeah.
It was while I was living in Melbourne. I saw an article in the news.com, it was a newspaper, on DMT, and it was full of disinformation, and it actually read like an advert for DMT.
Yeah.
And so I wrote an email to, you know, the ABC Media Watch people. Never heard back from them.
We've got a male Karen here.
Yeah, exactly. I did that. Didn't hear back from them. I was at a meeting I was a director for the Victorian Alcohol and Other Drugs Association, and was complaining to the fellow directors, like, this sucks. No one's responded to my email.
Yeah.
And someone said, well, maybe we need our own media watch. And I said, well, maybe that's not a bad idea. So that's kind of how it started, was just seeing poor media reporting, trying to use the existing systems to call it out. They weren't working. And so then just setting up our own thing and running with that.
That's awesome. That's what we do here.
Yeah.
We hate the media's lies and fear mongering and all the bullshit. So we try and cut through it to the truth of the matter.
There's probably a little less bro science.
There's actual science.
Yeah, actual science.
Yeah.
But so that's great. So
what have you found to be the biggest challenge there?
Oh, I think the biggest challenge is that those, you know, we were talking at the start, there are limited ways the media can talk about substance use, and they tend to just keep drawing on the same old narratives because, unfortunately, the media sell papers, they sell adverts, and so they need to create sensational stories that are going to sell their product.
Fear, hey?
Fear, stigma. There's one that I've got an intern working on at the moment, and it reads like an action movie. Like, the first line just paints an incredible picture of this guy crossing the border, and there's helicopters, and he's on meth, and just one sentence has so much packed into it.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is because that's what they do. That's their job.
Yeah.
And so. I'm not sure how. I'm actually not sure how we solve that, other than to educate the broader community to be aware that, you know, this is the model that you're getting your information from.
Yeah.
May not be always right.
Yeah. Well, a friend of mine who did journalism, the first thing they were taught was to start with something that either instills fear within the reader or hate.
Yeah.
So
if it bleeds, it leads.
Yeah.
It's fucking disgusting. Like, how about sharing a story about this, like, love, like a loving story where somebody's overcome diversity or adversity and fear.
Have you heard the Bill Hicks LSD story?
I haven't heard that.
No, you haven't heard it.
No.
So I won't do it justice. But basically, he says, you know, why, when I watch the news, do I hear all these bad stories about LSD? That's not been my experience.
Yeah.
I've taken it. It's been fucking awesome.
Yeah.
And so, you know, wouldn't it be just nice just once to have a positive LSD story?
Yeah.
And he gives an example of it. You know, Bob took some LSD and realised that all life is one and life is just a dream. And here's Bob with the weather.
Yeah.
Well,
that's good. Yeah, I think I've seen him do that bit.
What was that documentary that came out with all
the celebrities,
all the
and the
celebrities
mushrooms?
that just had mushrooms and LSD and all their first experiences?
It was on Netflix.
Yeah.
I know of it.
Have a good trip.
Have a good trip.
Yeah.
And that's a positive spin on what the hallucinogenics can do and give to you.
Yeah, and I think with cannabis, once it becomes medicalized, then you can actually start to provide those narratives that fit within a medical discourse, and people are getting better. There's epileptic kids that are no longer having seizures. All of a sudden, there is positive stories, and with psychedelics, as there's been all this hype at the moment, there is a lot more positive news stories. But if you look at other drugs that don't have a position, you know, a medical position, then they continue to be stigmatized and scapegoated.
Yeah.
So you say that
you don't hear like, oh, you know, the marathon runner just took massive dose of meth and now he's done 5 marathons.
yeah.
Like,
So you say it's obviously the media themselves, their own intrinsic reasoning for painting it in a negative light, but there must also be like an influence from above, like in regards to their alignments. They're clearly aligned to certain factions of a government and whatever their narrative is as well. So why would the government have an interest in really demonizing drugs?
It's a good question. I think one of the more superficial reasons is because their advertisers are alcohol. Like you'll see a story about, you know, meth is bad, and on the next page of the newspaper is the Dan Murphy special.
Yeah.
So
it's all about the people who are donating and funding the
but at the same time, I think you are onto something. I gave expert testimony at the New South Wales coronial inquest into 6 deaths at music festivals in one summer period.
I think they're on the way now. to go get
But they almost every news outlet was presenting a pretty balanced and reasonable picture of the evidence that had been provided. Most were supportive of pill testing. I mean, you had Koshy from 7, you know, Sunrise, grilling the New South Wales Premier, and he was coming from a pro-pill testing approach. But there was one news outlet that wasn't, the Daily Telegraph. Every day they were just putting negative stuff out. And I know this personally because I got thrown under the bus by them.
Yeah.
I turned up in Sydney. I got off the plane as I was walking through Sydney Airport, saw the Daily Telegraph, and there was a story about the inquest on it. So I picked it up and I'm in it. There's apparently I'd given evidence the day before while I was still in Perth, and it had been misrepresented.
so fake news.
Yeah, it actually was fake news. I took it to the press council. It went to arbitration, and I felt like I was actually going to win this thing.
Yeah.
And then it didn't go in my favour because the problem is the Australian Press Council is owned by the press. So who are they going to side with, me or the people that pay them?
Jeez. So what, they were using something that you'd said, but you hadn't even been there. They were using your image or your
it
quote.
said that I'd presented it. They'd used my written testimony, but said it as if I'd presented that in court. They accused me of skewing my data. It was
How infuriating.
Yeah, it was infuriating. It was disappointing. It was what the editorial in that day's Telegraph said. You know, how would the families feel that this guy's coming over and, you know, spruiking pill testing? I rang up one of my colleagues who was in court that day and I said, I've just got off the plane. What the fuck is going on? She said that the judge had actually explicitly, you know, held up this piece in the Telegraph and said, you know, the media need to use restraint when they're reporting on this issue. And she said, look, the families are lovely. They really want to hear your evidence. Like, don't hop on the plane and go home. Come in tomorrow and give your evidence. Because
if anything, they'll probably feel better because in future, if there's pill testing, the same thing won't happen to what happened to the kids.
And and they were really open to that. And so, you know, that fake news idea, what was interesting is you read that story and get a really different impression of what was going down at the coroner's court.
Yeah. And what do you think the future of festivals and pill testing is like? It would be great if the government could actually just manufacture stuff that was safe and we could buy it from them. But do you think what came of that actually? Yeah, I remember it going through, but I don't remember really a resolution.
Yeah, the recommendation from the coroner was a trial of pill testing. The New South Wales government just said they're not going to implement any of the recommendations.
What's the point of doing it?
Well, it is frustrating because around the same time they had an inquest into methamphetamine.
Yeah.
Similar recommendations. Victoria's had a methamphetamine parliamentary inquest. West Australia had an inquest in 2019. I gave evidence at that.
Yeah.
Some of the students at ECU gave evidence as well from Students for Sensible Drug Policy. Again, it's just there's all of these reports just piled up, gathering dust that nobody's looking at because I think the government wants to see that they're doing something about it, so they set up a parliamentary inquiry. But
that's it.
Then it gets shelved.
But again,
that's what it is. That's what they're doing about it. They do the inquiry and then they ignore all the recommendations that don't fit their narrative.
Yeah.
But is the inquiry actually conducted by themselves?
Yeah, it is, but it's always, people from all parties. So the West Australian parliamentary inquiry had representation from the Greens, from Labor, Liberal, Nationals, and Liberal Democrats. So there were 5 people in the room from 5 different political parties, and obviously they all had different vested interests, but it allowed, that each person would ask different questions based on their vested interests.
I always find it strange that studies or inquiries can be done when there's some really conflicting issues. For example, like we use the old sugar study back in the day, where it was actually funded by Coca-Cola, and clearly they're going to point towards fat being the issue, not sugar being the issue when it comes to heart disease and whatnot. And that you see that all the time. I see that even with the even like the recent with the COVID vaccine data. The studies are provided by the pharmaceutical companies themselves and then given to the FDA or the CDC and
that's how all pharmaceutical research
which
happens.
is so odd to me. Why would they report on something that's making them billions of dollars that there's an issue with it?
Yeah.
That just seems like there should be an independent study or an independent inquiry, and then they would say, well, you can't see our studies and our stuff because it's private and then we make money off it. So there's this huge conflicting issue, not just and I'm not trying to be like COVID vaccine conspiracies and all that stuff. I'm just saying this is an issue across the board.
To me, this comes back to the capitalist model. So we're treating pharmaceutical drugs within this capitalistic model, and so pharmaceutical companies are incentivized to create new compounds that are effective, that don't cause too many adverse effects, because ultimately they don't want their customers to die. That's not a good business model.
No.
But that with all the regulations in place now, it's approximately $1 billion to develop a drug and bring it to market.
Wow.
If you've spent $1 billion, and in that process, not every drug comes to market. Very few come to market because things are problematic sort of early on, and they if there's any hint of a sign that this isn't going to work, they just stop the research because it's too expensive.
Unless it's the COVID vaccine.
Yeah. Wow. That's a lot of money.
But then they have to recoup that money.
Yeah.
Like using the COVID vaccine example, if they've spent billions of dollars developing a vaccine, they need to recoup that money somehow.
Yeah.
It's strange because having spoken to a doctor recently just about an unrelated topic, I can't remember what it was. It was for not a fungal infection. What do they call it? A staph infection. Yeah. And it was he was talking to me, just randomly started talking about a different strain of this staph infection that's actually quite deadly. It's it's quite a deadly cause. Bad.
Just got to talk to it and ask it to go away.
Yeah. And he said it's very easy for them to put a bit of effort into developing some medicine to cure this, and it's done. But they would rather put their money into something that you have to have continuously.
Yeah, something that's more profitable.
Yeah, instead of here's a one source solution.
Cold source.
Yeah, well, exactly. Instead of let's cure fucking genital herpes or fucking something like staph infection or something like this. Instead of doing that, let's just make it we'll put our money in. Yeah, exactly. Diabetes, stuff like that. Like insulin. Here, we've already got insulin.
Yeah, it's capitalism.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you find that happens, or is that just a conspiracy?
No, I think it's problematic that I use the example of capitalism with a regulated drug market. It's the same problem with pharmaceuticals. I think anytime we're doing healthcare in a capitalistic model becomes problematic because the person's health is no longer the priority. It's profit that becomes the priority.
Yeah.
I think when profit is, and we've spoken about it already, when profit is the priority, that's when we're in a dangerous spot. And capitalism, I would much rather capitalism over communism or any, and socialism and whatnot. But this whole idea of prioritizing profit instead of the benefit of all.
Yeah, it seems like a way around it maybe is that with certain businesses within our society, things like pharmaceutical companies, that they have to operate within a different system. It's not that it's not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Like you say, capitalism is better than any other approaches that we've got at the moment. But maybe depending on the business that we're looking at, we might want to put some additional regulations in place to tighten things up for those businesses.
Yeah, and surely transparency with something so...
we don't talk about trans issues.
Yeah, but using like the COVID vaccine as a perfect example, I know they want to keep their I guess their
Formula.
recipe and formula close to
the
their
heart
chest.
attack inducing formula.
But exactly like be transparent about the issues you had in trials and stuff, but they don't want to even show that. So
the scary thing is we're seeing this now in the psychedelic space. This is again why I just want to crawl under a rock and not come back in 10 years and see how it's panned out. So with some of the MDMA trials overseas, there's evidence that they have not recorded some of the adverse events that they've seen, because let's just make the data look good and keep pushing this thing forward. And anybody that speaks out in the broader scientific community is kind of pushed back down by saying, well, you're against this movement. You're going to damage the whole movement.
Is that almost reverse misinformation, though, on purpose?
It is,
within the factions just saying, well, hey, we don't want this to succeed, so let's hide it. So then when it does come out, not completely researched, there is issues.
They do want it to succeed.
They want it to succeed.
Yeah, they want it to succeed.
Yes.
And if anybody's going...
No, but that's what I'm saying. Do you think there's factions that don't want it to succeed?
Absolutely, but they're not working in the clinical trials. They're working outside of the clinical trials. Like there's a guy from the UK that spent his whole career demonstrating that ecstasy is a dangerous drug. So he's still banging on about that now, even though all the clinical trials are happening, because if you've staked your whole career on something, it's very hard to do a 180. It's hard enough for politicians. They get called backflipping.
Yeah.
But surely that's what science is,
yeah,
isn't
that's
it?
unscientific.
It is. And I actually think a quality of a good researcher is somebody that is able to go, actually, I was wrong about this.
Yeah.
I retract that, and now I'm open to looking at this other data and doing a 180 based on the new information that's come in.
It's just sad that people aren't educated. It should be part of your uni course when you start studying. Hey, if your data's not matching your hypothesis, or if your data isn't matching your outlook, then stop and relook at yourself instead of trying to change.
Surely that is anyway.
That is in the curriculum. The problem is, I think once you're 20 or 30 years in, you've staked your whole career on it.
It's an ego thing.
Yeah,
hey?
and MDMA is one example. I've seen it with people that have developed psychotherapeutic approaches, and that's their approach. Yeah. That's an example of another group that are. That don't want to see MDMA therapy succeed because they see it as a threat to the treatment they've either developed or spent 20 years getting trained in. You don't want to throw all of that training out.
Be diverse. Warren Buffett wouldn't invest in a stock and go, "Oh no, that's it. I'm sticking with these 3D printers. Yeah. That's it. I'm going to stick."
Like Delby did.
Yeah. That's my own trauma. But give that UK bloke some mushrooms, kill his ego, and it might change a little bit.
I was about to say, do you think maybe they need this sort of therapy themselves to go, hey, now I can take a step back and realize I was wrong?
I actually think it would make it worse. Ooh. So one of the things that isn't really talked about in the psychedelic space as well is some personality types. So people with a narcissistic personality, it tends to actually strengthen their narcissistic personality. It doesn't soften it. And so, you see this with even people like Timothy Leary that come sort of guru-like. It hardens up their narcissism. So, people joke, we should just chuck some LSD in the punch at Parliament or give Trump some LSD. It'll actually make him worse. Wow. And so I think, in the same vein, these individuals that have staked their career on it, it would just harden their resolve.
So I guess that's Hitler probably had a fuck.
Yeah, it wouldn't help Hitler. It wouldn't help Trump. There's a bunch of people that psychedelics aren't going to help.
And I guess that's why it's so important to have these
clinical trials.
Yeah, exactly. To make sure we're not just one size fits all approach, which is always an issue in anything.
Yeah.
There's no one size fits all approach. You've just made a perfect example. Hey, there's a lot of people benefiting from LSD and whatnot, but these people are not going to benefit. So
neither are people with schizophrenia, bipolar disorder. There's a range of people that would get worse from it.
Yeah.
And we usually, in clinical trials, we exclude all those people, and it's kind of obvious. I guess it's obvious in that the layperson would know that it's not a good idea for someone with schizophrenia to take LSD. That's kind of obvious.
Yeah.
But with narcissism, it's something that's less popularized. It's something people would be less aware of. And I think it's something that we're not really talking about in the scientific community either. We're excluding these people, but not really talking about why.
Because it's a personality trait, isn't it? It's not really a very immeasurable.
Is narcissism, have you done much study? Is that brought on by nature or nurture, or is that brought on by status and position, or somebody becoming rich really young in life and then never being told no?
Well, personality is something that firms up around 17, 18, 19, 20. And you usually don't see many changes in personality once your personality is set. And so it's both nature and nurture. There's going to be genetic elements. Then, if you're, depending on what sort of temperament you have as an infant, that's going to affect the way that your parents start interacting with you. So you can't really separate out nature from nurture. But once it's kind of established, that's the person's personality. One of the interesting things about psychedelics is not only do they tend to firm up a narcissistic personality, they tend to increase people's levels of openness when they have the capacity to do so, because we normally don't see changes in personality. Psychedelic research has been one of the few avenues where they've shown that the person's personality in terms of their openness actually increases.
Why do narcissists, I guess, do they not open up, and do the mushrooms or the psychedelics or whatever they've had make them feel like they're more godlike?
Yeah, I think look, I've seen narcissism even just, among people engaging in the ayahuasca scene. You see somebody that feels like they've got very special knowledge that they've received, and only they have that knowledge, and you wouldn't understand.
Oh, I fucking hate them people.
And they're going back again and again to drink ayahuasca because they've got this special relationship with it. But if you pin them down and ask them, tell me about this special information, oh, no, I need to drink more ayahuasca, they won't actually give you any of that information. So...
So is there much research into something as harsh as DMT and
dimethyltryptamine?
Yes.
Yeah, so
Thank you,
DMT.
Daniel.
Yeah.
Is it DMT? We'll stick with DMT. Easier for me to pronounce. Is there much research into that and the benefits that's gone into that?
Well, the kind of what kicked off the research into psychedelics again was a study using DMT. So Rick Strassman grew up, was studying psychiatry just as everything was getting shut down. So he wanted to be a psychedelic therapist, a psychedelic psychiatrist. In the late 90s, he approached one of his mentors and said, I want to get this research up and happening again. The mentor suggested that he use DMT for a couple of reasons. One, it's short acting. Two, nobody knows what it is. So it's going to get through ethics, and it's not going to create a media storm.
Yeah.
And so he was giving healthy volunteers intramuscular injections of DMT, and he was just doing really basic research, which his mentor had recommended. Just look at people's blood plasma and some readouts on that. Nothing therapeutic or anything like that. And what's interesting is, over time, he was speaking to the people as they were sort of coming out of the experience, and they were saying, I was in another dimension. And he said, so it felt like you were in another dimension. They said, no, you weren't there. I was in another dimension.
I was talking to the Anunnaki.
Yeah. and so he did a bit of a thought experiment and said, well, what if I just go along with this? And then he collected all of this really rich qualitative data from people's experiences. And he wrote a book called DMT, The Spirit Molecule, which sort of puts those experiences into a couple of different categories. It's a bit like qualitative research. So he found that people either had sort of like those entity type experiences, or they had a near-death experience. I can't think of what the third
was. It the geometric shapes experience where they was just there?
I think that was for all people who had the geometric shapes.
That's where I got when I had I didn't get past an entity or anything like that. Yeah.
Yeah. It kind of... That sort of kind of opened Pandora's box to this, because it said that you could do research in this area again. Then probably took another 5 to 10 years before John Hopkins did the first trial again. First trial again as in since prohibition, where they again used healthy volunteers and gave them psilocybin to see whether they could induce a mystical experience in people, and they found that they were able to do so. And it was such a powerful mystical experience that people reported it, being in their top 5 most significant experiences of their life. So that includes the birth of their child and things like that. And they saw that when they followed them up at, I think at 24 months, 2 years later, they were still saying that it was one of the most powerful experiences they've had in their life.
And you know you're getting good shit because it's from like a clinic.
Hopkins, yeah.
And I'm pretty sure that's how Stranger Things started. Just ripped a hole in another dimension.
I did hear in your TED talk you were talking about the pushback from certain areas in regards to the way they want to research, and a university just completely shutting down or vetoing the fact that we want to do research within this, and they just said no, we're not going to do it. Why would someone like at a university that would be surely inclined in learning and at worst proving
it could
that
be like ECU saying back then, probably the stigma you can answer, but I'm just thinking like if it would be like ACU going, hey, we're just going to do some meth research here.
Yeah.
Because the society would be like, what?
Yeah.
Is that what the pushback?
Yeah, that was the pushback.
Yeah.
And it's a really interesting story. So it was Deakin University was the university that, before it even hit ethics, the Deputy Vice Chancellor of Research stepped in and said, no, we're not doing this at our university. The psychiatrist involved, Nigel Strauss, he's since donated personally close to $500,000 to Monash University, so they're doing the study anyway at Monash, and he's bankrolled it.
Yeah.
So Deakin kind of missed out on that.
Wow.
But I we regrouped in 2017. Nothing was still happening in Australia in 2017. We regrouped. There was a bunch. Rick Doblin from MAPS. I think Ben Sessa was over from the UK. So international psychedelic researchers, and we're saying, we don't think we can do this in Australia. We've been trying this now for like 7 or 8 years. It's not happening. And Rick said, well, we set up MAPS in 1986 and we completed our first trial in 2008 or whatever. I think it was 2008. It's basically harden up. It's going to take a while.
Yeah, narcissist up.
But everything just kind of fell into place after that. There was somebody at that conference from St Vincent's Hospital, and they were working in palliative care. They were really keen to see psilocybin trial in the hospital, and that's when that's when I said, I could go down the psilocybin route or the MDMA route. So that kind of happened. At the same time, I got back after that regrouping session and sent an email to my Deputy Vice Chancellor at ECU. I just started there. But based on the experience at Deakin, I thought, well, we need to start at the top, just feel them out. So I sent an email knowing that he had a background in medicine, just with a couple of papers demonstrating the efficacy of MDMA therapy, and he wrote back and said, why aren't we doing this in Australia? I said, that's the answer I want.
Wow, that's awesome. Wow. I guess we've got a few more avenues. How are you going for time?
Yeah, I'm fine.
You all right?
We do have some questions from viewers.
Yeah, I just want to hit 3 things on that one. The palliative care just spoke my interest just then, because my mum, she works in a nursing home. She sees people lose the battle with life all the time. How did psychiatrics, psilocybin or MD or whatever it was, how did that improve their quality of life? And were people like tripping balls before they die and it helped them, or was it more like to come to terms with?
It's more to come to terms to accept the fate. So it's only been provided with people that are experiencing significant distress or depression.
Yep.
I think the way it works with depression is similar to the way it's working with depression with people with treatment-resistant depression, where we're doing research with psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy. Like you were talking about that feeling that that it doesn't matter. Like this shit doesn't matter anymore. That it allows people to have a bit of psychological flexibility. The trip itself, you have to sort of just accept and ride it and sort of just let go of things, which is going to be helpful for people who are dying as well. Essentially, one way of thinking about the psychedelic experience with ego death is it's like a way of preparing for dying. Like if you can let go and just accept what's happening, then you can accept your fate, you can accept your experience. And the results have been quite promising. So people's anxiety drops right off, their depression comes down. And that generally that generally lasts for a period of time. Not everybody that's been in these trials has died, so some of them have recovered. And there's not a lot of published analysis of this, but I've heard a couple of the US researchers say that there's a bit of a signal in the data that indicates people that went through this treatment versus the control group are living longer, which would make sense because we know that stress, is not, it's correlated with everything bad. It's not good for anything. Yeah. And so if you're less anxious, you're less depressed, and you're less stressed. And so maybe that helps with your immune system to be able to fight the condition.
Yeah, because your body reflects your psychological state as well. Yeah. So if you've been able to drop away all of that, then your inflammation and your stress response and everything else is more calm.
I suspect with palliative care that mystical experience is important as well. Yeah. Because if you have some sort of religious, spiritual belief, then it kind of affirms that. Because it's one thing to read something in a book, it's another to actually experience that mystical state and go, actually, everything is all right. I'm going to be all right. Yeah. Whatever it is I believe in, it's just confirmed it. Yeah. And even people that don't have strong beliefs, that might be atheists, even that feeling of oneness and connectedness, it kind of opens their mind and gives them a sense of reassurance to be able to accept their situation because everything is going to be okay.
That's great. And earlier on, you were mentioning, it just struck a thought with me that you were doing PTSD trials with MDMA. I know for a fact we've got a few listeners because we focus heavily on mental health as well as having a laugh. Can people sign up for that? Because there's a few people I know that are listening now that have PTSD. If they want to sign up for clinical trials, is that a possibility, or what's the process with that?
For the Perth trial, it's really limited. We don't have enough places to be able to sign any new people up, which is unfortunate. We're trying to work on getting funding at the moment from
the Hard Yarns podcast.
But we're trying to get philanthropic funding at the moment for that.
See if Twiggy Forrest will give you a little bit of his fortune.
Yeah, he's already done. There's another company in Perth called Amira that are looking at doing a trial, but I'm not sure if it would be in Perth. It might be in Melbourne, but Twiggy actually has donated money to that.
That's awesome.
I'm involved with a group.
We need him mushroom forest now.
I'm involved in a new company that's set up in Perth they were part of Little Green Farmer, which is a cannabis company. They've set up like a sister company called Reset Mind Sciences. Cool. Gina Reinhardt's been an investor in that. We're doing a clinical trial of psilocybin-assisted treatment for treatment-resistant depression. Yep. There's another MDMA trial that hasn't started yet at Monash University in Melbourne. This whole scene is blowing up very quickly. I guess the one thing I could say to people that are looking for the opportunity to participate in something like that is, while there might not be an option now, there will be very soon in the future. The government threw $15 million at it. There was five or seven groups that got funding to run clinical trials out of that. Cool. So there is a lot happening in the space, and so I would encourage people to just to be patient and because it will happen. This is coming, and to not go out and do some DIY MDMA therapy because it's more than just taking MDMA. There's the intention, there's the psychotherapeutic component, and you don't know the quality of the MDMA that you're accessing. That's why I'm big on drug checking, pill testing. It's to help people identify what's going. The market is so tainted. There's all kinds of shit that's going around.
It's really interesting to hear about people going, "Oh, I had MD once, and then it made me like loop out and spew." I'm like, "What the fuck? That's not MDMA. That's not what you should be experiencing."
There's hundreds of drugs that we're identifying in Australian so-called MDMA.
Yeah, and the synthetic stuff is pretty scary as well. Even though MDMA is synthetic.
That's quiet on that.
But the other thing, I had a friend who participated in ketamine trials in London where they were just injecting it into her. She reckons it was like unbelievable. I can't remember what the trial was for, but do you have anything to do with any ketamine research, or is that a little bit left of field? I
don't have... I mean, ketamine's interesting. You can access ketamine in Australia outside of clinical trials. It's a Schedule 8 drug, so a pain specialist or a psychiatrist can prescribe it off-label, and there are clinics already doing ketamine infusions in Perth. Yeah. So you can access that treatment outside of a clinical trial. I've actually got some personal experience with ketamine that I can share. Yep. Just before I left Melbourne to come back to Perth, so I spent 10 years in Melbourne. I signed up for a trial at Monash University where they were looking at the effects of ketamine on driving. And so I got hooked up to an IV. not in a car. It was a driving simulator.
I was going to say, that is like...
But they
just
started...
if you could drive home and let us know how it goes.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not really rocket science. I think ketamine's going to affect your driving, but I participated in the trial nonetheless. I wanted to sit in the other seat of a clinical trial and have that experience,
Yeah, cool.
and 2, it was free ketamine.
Yeah.
And it was like they started with it was called a bolus dose, so a really high dose, and I had a K-hold on the first dose, and there was somebody.
Explain the K-hole for people.
Well, people that use ketamine, people generally, there's 2 types of ketamine use. There's people will bump it and just have bumps of it, and it's kind of like alcohol. It just takes the edge off. It's kind of a nice euphoric feeling. But if you take too much, you become anaesthetized.
Yeah.
And that's not ideal if you're bumping, because you usually are at a doof or something like that. And if you're in an anesthetic state at a doof, it's not ideal. But some people actually are chasing that K-hole. They'll do it at home in a safe place and just inject themselves with 100 milligrams of ketamine because they like K-holing.
Wow.
Some people like it, some people don't.
Yeah.
So my experience was there was a registrar, like a medical registrar, that was watching over me at the time. And as I was coming out of it, I said, I think I told you I loved you. And he said, that's all right, mate. I've heard a lot worse.
Oh, wow. Yeah,
And now
okay.
you're married. Oh, wow. So let me get this straight. Like, have this dose, drive this car, and you just get knocked out. And you just go in a K-hole, you're like, bye.
Yeah, well, the first dose was to get it in your system.
Yeah.
Because they were doing saliva tests and taking bloods to see how much ketamine was in your system.
Yeah.
And obviously you can't drive a car while you're K-holing.
Yeah, yeah.
But as I was coming out of it, they'd wheel the simulator in front and say, time to go for a drive.
Oh, I thought they were like, here, get in the seat. We'll just smash you full of cat and you just pass you out and hit a light pole straight away.
I've got a couple of questions from some listeners that we will get to.
Cool.
Some of them you've already probably answered. So can you ask about psilocybin mushrooms for thought regression therapy? Is that
regression therapy? I don't know much about thought regression therapy.
Okay, sorry, Macphail. Tex, he's asked what's the correct amount to microdose. Not that we're condoning medicating, but
one thing I'd say about microdosing, because I've done a bit of research in the area, the jury is still out on whether it even works or not, because it could be a placebo effect. Because if you take something and think it's going to improve your performance, it's going to make you more creative, it's going to sort out your depression and anxiety, the placebo effect means that it's likely to have that effect that you're expecting, the expectancy effect. I've got a colleague that's getting people to microdose at the moment, bringing them into his lab and getting them to do tests. There was a trial done. There are clinical trials, but they're still very small. It looks like there might be a signal there, but definitely the jury is still out on whether it works. We certainly don't know if it does work, why it works, because it's not working the same way as the psychedelic effects work.
Yeah.
In terms of a dose, it's the general rule of thumb is it's 1/10 of a standard psychedelic dose. So with LSD, maybe 10 micrograms.
Yeah.
okay. And so filtering on for that, Matt Aussie's asked microdosing with mushrooms, higher doses every now and then. What's what's more beneficial? So either microdosing or just every now and then having one big hit of mushrooms.
This is my personal. Yeah. This isn't based on that much science, other than what I've talked about with the microdosing. The jury's still being out, and there's clear data showing benefit for macrodosing, so taking those higher doses. So personally, I think that you would get more benefit from using one larger dose rather than the microdosing. People that microdose swear by it, and I've spoken to a number of people that microdose and swear by it. I think at the end of the day, it's what the person feels works best for them. So if I speak to someone that's a real advocate of their own microdosing, I'm not going to persuade them to save it up and take a macrodose. In the same way, if somebody hasn't got the benefits from microdosing and they've got benefits from macrodosing, I'm not going to tell them start microdosing because they've already played with it and didn't work.
All up to the individual. And
I guess on the clinical trials, you'd be giving people the placebo as well with the microdosing, right? To see if they... Yeah, right.
Matt also asked, ayahuasca ceremonies taking place in Perth. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, they are.
Do you think that's an issue? Taking place away from
the traditional.
Actually, I think it's better that it takes place away from it. Look, I understand why some people would have issue with it being taken outside of that cultural context, but from a harm reduction perspective, it's probably safer to do it here. If something does go wrong, you know the system, you know how to access things.
Yeah. You're not stuck in the jungle.
Yeah, with the closest hospital's a 10-kilometre walk or something.
Yeah.
And on that note, I've got a mate who, I won't say his profession, but he was saying Aboriginal Australians have found something similar. Do you know much about Indigenous to Australian DMT and ayahuasca? It's a form of ayahuasca. I think it was
Acacia?
Acacia.
Acacia-wasca. So the Australian flora, particularly the acacia wattle species, have some of the highest concentrations of DMT worldwide. And so there's been speculation that it might have been used traditionally. And look, there's lots of evidence of other substances being used traditionally, like patchouli, which is a nicotine-type gum that used to be made. I think there's not a lot. It's based on speculation as to whether it's happening or not. And I sometimes when I get asked this question, say if I'm in a movie screening or someone asks me this question, I'll usually say, well, the reason we don't have stronger evidence is there's been such a history of biopiracy and all kinds of really bad things that Western people have done to Indigenous Australians. So why would they want to voluntarily give that information up? I think there probably is knowledge around traditional use of some of these things, but it's not being shared. And I think rightfully so. I think that I certainly don't push to find out that information because I think if it's there, then it should stay there.
Yeah. And I guess you'd need the other plant to stop our body breaking it down as well, hey? So.
There's two hypotheses that are out there. One is that it could be, sure, it wouldn't be extracted, but it could be used in a bark product mixed with ash and made into like a gum or something, which would be sublingual. Or maybe there's other plants in Australia that contain monoamine oxidase inhibitors.
Yeah, to inhibit it. Benefits of mushrooms and acid, we sort of touched on that, but is there any... We don't really need to go on that. Simple Life of Sim, you would have heard that one. Nikki Justice, she's asked, why do I keep spewing when I take mushrooms?
Do mushrooms have an effect on the stomach, like where it causes stomach abdominal pain?
So psilocybin itself even causes a little bit of nausea, but in a mushroom you've got a bunch of other things in there other than psilocybin. The thing I'm most aware of with the physiological effects of psilocybin containing mushrooms is actually wood lovers paralysis. So particularly the Australian sub-Aeryngosia, which is our native species, they grow they grow off wood. Wood is their food. They eat wood, which is they're kind of composting machines. For some reason, not only ours but also similar species that grow elsewhere in the world, every now and then they cause this syndrome of paralysis where the person has complete paralysis, usually just after they're coming down, usually not mid-trip. But it's obviously very, very scary when that's happening. And we don't know why. Nobody knows why it's happening. And when I first got interested in this area 10 years ago, I found out about it and I spoke to someone in the community and they said, oh, yeah, that happens, but we don't talk about that. I said, what do you mean? They said, oh, we don't want to scare people off.
Wow. How long's the paralysis?
Several hours.
Oh, my God.
So I guess this is the exact reason why research is important into these sorts of issues, because there's clear benefits that we can see, but there's obviously, like all other things, there's side effects for the wrong person or for whatever, if it's taken incorrectly. At least
if you know about it, then you don't freak out when it happens.
Which is exactly why we need to do the research. And I guess that's probably what we'll finish on is, like, obviously it's become less taboo to do these sorts of research. How does it look going forward, and where is the? I guess. Okay. How does that go going forward? Like, how do we look going forward in regards to the research? Is it pretty easy now to get into that?
Well, I think the main barrier now is that the for for lack of a better term, the stigma associated with the research itself has been removed. In fact, there's the opposite. People have got an appetite for doing this research. It's funding it. Where's the money going to come from? And that goes back to these issues of capitalism. Like, do we take money from companies and help them develop new drugs that they're going to sell? I've up until recently partnering with Reset Mind Sciences. I've worked in the not-for-profit space, and we've tried to gather philanthropic funding, and that's purely based on that's what MAPS were doing, and we've tried to replicate what MAPS were doing. But Rick from MAPS has been saying, with all of these companies starting up, he's finding it more difficult to generate the revenue for MAPS now, because why would you donate money when you could invest in this company instead?
Make more money.
And so, I think the main barrier moving forward will be investment. And going back to the conversation around pharmaceuticals, if for a new drug to cost $1 billion to get to market, where are we going to find that sort of money to bring this to market? And I think a day or two ago I read an analysis of sort of from Business Insider, looking at they did an analysis of all the psychedelic companies, and the main points were most of these companies that are sort of trying to get investment at the moment aren't going to have any product on the market for at least 10 years from now. So it's still a long way off because of the cost of bringing a drug to market. The clinical trials that are available are still quite small compared to what's required by places like the TGA and FDA, EMA. So we need more rigorous research, but who's going to pay for this research?
Did you say that, like with PTSD, with soldiers, for example, was that the number one cause of deaths?
Suicide. Yeah, it is.
For suicide.
Yeah.
So you'd think that would, warrant a lot of funding or even government funding towards something like this if it's such a prevalent issue within society.
You'd
and
think
it wouldn't
so, wouldn't you?
Yeah, and it wouldn't. It's not just. That's the high end of the scale, coming back from war, from that sort of conflict. But PTSD in all forms, I must be addressed.
One of the things I've learned on this journey is Australia is just so conservative. And, with the experiences with the universities, and I was speaking many years ago. I was speaking on a podcast with somebody from the UK, and he said, "What do you mean it's conservative? All of the Australians I've met are really creative thinking type people." And I said, yeah, that's because you're meeting all the tourists that are travelling in Europe. They're different to the average Australian.
Yeah, different mindset.
We have this culture of tall poppy syndrome and things like that. We actually look at the hate to bring it back to COVID, but look at our vaccination rates. We are a conformist culture. We don't like to be the tall poppy, and I think that conservatism's kind of been holding Australia back in terms of this research. We've now seen some government funding, it's not a world first, but it's a world second or third, which isn't bad. And at the end of the day, the research internationally is so far advanced now that MDMA may be an FDA-approved medication in 2 years from now. So it's less about in Australia needing to do the research on whether it works, and like the research we're doing, just demonstrate, can we do it safely? What infrastructure do we need to be able to provide this treatment? Because the research into the effectiveness is just about being completed now.
Yeah. We need a tall mushroom syndrome.
That's great. You got one final question?
So what is the main helping point or points from using psychedelics to help people with addiction and anxiety issue? Is it we probably cover this on the next time. If you'd like to come back, we'd love to have you. Because we didn't really talk too much about treating addiction or dependence. So I won't finish that one off, sorry.
Well, very briefly, there's evidence for its efficacy in the treatment of smoking cessation, but again, it's promising and early, and more research needs to happen. So an open-label trial with no control group found, I think, 80% of people were able to quit smoking and maintain that at 6 or 12-month follow-up. There's been research with alcohol as well that's shown some efficacy there. MDMA has been shown to be effective for people with trauma comorbid with alcohol use disorder. And I think LSD was being used in the 60s to treat alcohol dependence. So I think that's probably a good indication, and there will be more research sort of looking at that in the future.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Because he was asking, I guess he's just asking, does it get you thinking a different way or get your body feeling different different moods?
I think it's about the thinking. It changes your perspective of your relationship with that drug and the impact that it's having on you, the impact it's having on other people. Because like that conversation we had, if you're me, then and I'm treating you like shit because I'm needing to get money to use this drug, well, maybe I need to stop using this drug, so I stop treating you like shit because you're me.
Yeah, that's good.
That's all. And I guess it's great to have these open conversations with people who have had experiences themselves, because the people who push back are the ones who generally have never experienced psychedelic drugs or experiences themselves. And I always feel like, how can you understand what real reality is without having not experienced reality? I guess a different form of reality, and it gives you a better understanding of what we are experiencing now. In my humble, uneducated opinion. But I always feel like to have a better appreciation for what we have here and what you're experiencing now, you need to experience other versions.
One of the things that that they were doing, they've stopped doing it with the MDMA trials, and I missed out on this, was ensuring that the therapists have undergone an MDMA experience themselves. So there was a clinical trial just for the therapists.
Wow.
And they're now doing a world first in Australia is at Monash University. They're now doing that with psilocybin. So as part of the psilocybin clinical trial looking at generalized anxiety disorder, all of the therapists are going to be administered psilocybin themselves.
Wow.
I think that's important, because how can you be in charge of something that you haven't tried yourself?
Yeah.
And then there's,
formulating an opinion
debate,
and without
the
having
flip side to
experience
the argument is, which I don't necessarily subscribe to, is, think about psychiatry or medicine. People that are writing those scripts haven't tried all of the different drugs that they're writing scripts for.
Yeah.
That's true as well.
That's true.
Yeah.
Well, maybe in a couple of months we can get you back on and talk specifically about dependence and addiction. And
that's really interesting.
Dive deeper into that.
I wonder if it helps gambling.
Yeah. Well, I think we've touched on quite a lot today, and that's a lot for
and
process.
Canada have just decriminalised a ton of drugs.
Everything.
Really?
Basically decriminalised.
Because there's a
everything.
huge difference between decriminalisation and legalisation, and people I don't think understand that. But
I agree. I think that, and that's a problem with moving drug policy forward, is that people assume it's all the same thing, where it's actually quite different.
Yeah. Okay.
All right, mate, my mind is very full.
Yeah.
I'm going to have to go back and listen to this one, because there's some interesting things that we spoke about.
Thanks for your time, and I'm going to see you hopefully at the Teacher Comedy Night, July 8th.
That'd be awesome, yeah.
Yeah, that'd be great. Really appreciate you coming back in, and we'll definitely, as long as you're keen, get you back in to talk about dependence and addiction in more depth.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Ciao.